Good morning, everybody. We're just going to give a minute or so to make sure all of our participants can get logged in, and then we'll be getting started shortly. Thanks for joining us today. I think we're going to get started now, and people may jump in at the end or as we continue, but we're so thrilled to have you all. My name is Libby Sobic. I am the Director of Education Policy at Will, and I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague, Will Flanders, who's the Director of Research at Will. Today, we're going to be talking about the status of education in Wisconsin. This is really in response to recent news reports about how well Wisconsin schools are doing compared to our state peers. And we really wanted to take an opportunity to talk through the research, where we've been, and what does the state of Wisconsin really look like in terms of education. For those of you who aren't familiar with us at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, we are a nonprofit law and policy center located in Milwaukee. We have both an education policy side to our work as well as an education litigation side. And we think it's really important that we are a part of the public conversation around how we do policy improvements in a variety of topics, including education. Much of the conversation you're going to hear from Flanders and I today is going to be based on a lot of policy research that's done in-house at Will, also highlighting research by our partners and friends from around the country. So with that, I am going to kick it off to my colleague, Will Flanders.
So much, Libby, and thanks to everyone for joining. I'll say as we go through here, if you have questions as they go through, but we'll certainly get them at the end. So it's good to put those things in there while you're thinking of them. So what we're beginning here with is something Libby alluded to. That was U.S. News and World Report rankings that have. We've seen a statistic being pushed by a lot of different folks, and a lot of folks that don't necessarily have a good understanding of what's going into it. But as you can see at the top of the screen here, actually we're showing the overall top 10, Wisconsin down there at number 8. But these are the factors that were considered by U.S. News and World Report: college readiness, high school graduation, NAEP scores in math and reading, and then preschool enrollment. And you can see, if you look down at the bottom there, if your screen is large enough, Wisconsin's not so good on college readiness, pretty good on these middle categories, and not so good on the preschool enrollment category either. And Libby said my sound is coming off a little bit garbled here, so let me improve that at all. Apologies to everyone. But so what you can see here is that, yeah, Wisconsin's ranked in the top 10, but there's some important factors that you should consider, with this ranking. First of all, we know we've just come through a pandemic that has a huge impact on education. And the data that goes into this report is actually pre-pandemic. This data comes from the 2020 and 2019 school year. Also, the rankings here don't account for student demographics. So unfortunately, know that economic status and race and other factors as well often play a big role. The level of achievement that students ultimately achieve. And when you don't account for those factors, it's hard to have a non-biased ranking. And so what we tried to wrestle with here, what we're trying to examine is, what is the true state of education in Wisconsin today? And are we truly a top 10 state in education? Spoiling the rest of this presentation, the answer to some extent, we think is no. So, to understand the status of education today, you have to understand where it's been in the last several decades. And I think Libby is going to go through some of the highlights as to where we've come from over time.
Yes, so we really wanted to start in the 1990s when Wisconsin enacted the country's first voucher program in Milwaukee. The reason why we think it's so important to sort of look back before we can talk about the status today is so much of the status of our education has been generational changes and policy implementation. And so we really wanted to kind of walk everyone through what the state has done and what people were saying about the state of education through each of these decades. So in the early 1990s, Governor Tommy Thompson passed and signed the bill for the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. And I wanted to include a little bit of a quote that we were hearing legislative leaders say at the time that they believed in empowering parents to give students in Milwaukee access to high quality educational options. And I think it's really important to recognize that what we're saying today, our allies and previous leaders were saying over 30 years ago. And so at the bottom of these slides, you're going to see kind of key things that happened during the time and the policy implementations that we're talking about. We won't go into a lot of depth on those, but please feel free to use the chat question if you have a specific question about any of those timeline notes that we put in. So we started the voucher program. They talked about empowering parents in Milwaukee, but why were they talking about that? And I'll let Flanders address what we knew about education at the time.
Yeah, so this is the Wisconsin NAEP rankings over time. So we just discussed how the NAEP overall doesn't fully account for the demographics of students in the state. And what you can see here is, looks complex, but it's actually relatively simple. What we have is the yellow line represents the overall NAEP ranking of Wisconsin year by year. These are the results for math, though it looks pretty similar for reading. The blue line represents when we make a demographic adjustment to adjust for the factors that we know influence student achievement. And what you can see is that, in the mid 90s, Wisconsin ranked relatively well. But over time, we've seen a gap emerge between the achievement that's actually reported and the achievement that would be expected based on demographics. So as we're thinking about the 90s, moving into the 2000s, the context here that's important is to realize that we're seeing a growing gap between overall achievement and sort of expected achievement. And even in the yellow line, the top line, that's the actual ranking, you can see that Wisconsin did take a dive to a pretty substantial extent. And we didn't put the whole scale on here, but that's in the sort of early 2000s. And so that's the context as we're thinking about school choice programs and growing educational options for families. As these rankings decline, families realize more and more that they needed these options. And this is just another depiction of the NAEP data. I think it's important to highlight. We do it quite often, but it's a statistic that needs to be hammered home pretty often. That Wisconsin continues to have the largest achievement gap in the country. And as you look, this isn't a new phenomenon. So again, going back to 1990, the crosses on the bottom represent achievement for African American students. The circles on top represent achievement for white students. And this gap is pretty substantial. And while it's substantial in almost every state, the distance here is larger in almost every year the data is measured than any other state in the country. So when we think about things like the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, the initial school choice program in Wisconsin, this achievement gap was a big impetus for creating that program, recognizing particularly that while education is struggling around the state, it's particularly struggling in the urban communities in Wisconsin, and that obviously those students more than any other potentially need some alternative options.
I also just want to highlight for our participants that this gap hasn't really closed. As you can see throughout the years, as of 2019, we weren't all that different than 1992. And so one of the myth busts that we really want to have addressed in our presentation is that, if that makes us number 7 or top 10 in the nation, then we really have a pretty big concern about what the measurements we're looking at for success, because excellence has to be more than just, a number on a spreadsheet. It really has to be about our students and children performing and learning. So we're going to move to the next decade into the early 2000s. And the biggest thing that happened at this point is that there was a massive legal battle at the United States Supreme Court. And ultimately, the United States Supreme Court ruled that vouchers were constitutional. And that not only allowed the opportunity to grow school choice programs across the country and follow the Wisconsin model, but it also meant that our program, there was really no longer an argument that there was a legal barrier. And so participation exploded. As you can see on the timeline, when we started in the early 90s with the program, we were capped at about 500 students. By 2005, we had 22,500 students participating in the program. And so we were already seeing massive demand in a pretty short period of time as this program was getting off the ground. The other thing I wanted to note is that in 2009, the state changed the law and required students participating in these programs to also take the state's exam, which is some of the data that we're also going to be referencing today. But we can't go really back farther than 2009 because it was at this point when students were required, who were in the voucher program, to start taking the state's exam.
So as we talk about this program that's been around since 1990, the reality is that that's allowed us to be sort of the center for experimentation on school choice around the country. What you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here is the number of studies of private school choice programs around the country. And despite being a much smaller in terms of population state than Florida, we're actually one above Florida in terms of the number of studies that have been conducted. Wisconsin has the most school choice research out there with 28 studies of private school choice. And this really means that, not only, are we sort of serving as a model for other states around the country as to what school choice can be, but we also have more data on how school choice affects kids in Wisconsin than we do in any other state. What you can see on this slide is just an example of some of the research over time on the test score outcomes of participants. We pulled this from EdChoice, which is a great national resource for school choice data that I'd recommend to everyone here. That's not anyone who's not familiar. But what you can see on the sort of green columns here was there any positive effect identified in this research? And what you can see on the location side, there's some Milwaukee studies in here that did find a positive relationship between participation in school choice and academic achievement. And that's pretty consistent around the country. There's really only been one or two studies that have found a negative effect on achievement. Those have been centered in Louisiana and a couple in Washington, D.C. as well. But the overall picture of school choice research, both from Wisconsin and nationally, is that there is a positive effect. On this slide, we're looking at the attainment outcomes of participants. So this is a question of whether or not students eventually achieve either high school or college graduation. And what you can see here is, again, there's a lot of green in the school choice columns, even including a study from 2019 that actually followed kids from essentially 2008 to 2011 through their college career, and found that kids that participated in choice in Milwaukee were in fact more likely to graduate from college than students who didn't participate. And again, this is consistent with a lot of other research. No research here on attainment has actually found negative outcomes.
So with that background on research and what we were starting to see in these programs, demand for access to these programs started to grow around the state. And so in the 2010s, it was the era with the Governor Walker administration. And so it was at this time where Governor Walker and the Republican legislature created and expanded our school choice programs and options around the state. We first created the Racine Parental Choice Program, followed by the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program. And then in 2015, the Special Needs Scholarship Program was created. And I think a lot of that is not only due to demand from families, but also this research was really showing tangible benefits, not only in communities, but in students' lives. And so we're very proud of the fact that Wisconsin continued to grow our programs so more families could access a high quality school.
I think it's important to note as we're moving through the decades here that a growing problem that we see in Wisconsin schools is chronic absenteeism. So chronic absenteeism is essentially the number of students that are absent for more than 10% of the school year days. And we've seen growing percentages statewide in the number of kids that are that are chronically absent from school. So you look at this chart that goes back to 2014, we were around 11% of students that were chronically absent. By 2020, which was obviously during the pandemic year and the year after, we're seeing rates that have expanded to or grown to more than 16%. Obviously, if kids aren't in school, there's limited or no learning that's going to take place. We all saw that during the pandemic as we saw the growth of achievement gaps from kids being out of the classroom. And we'll see later how the state has kind of gamed the system and saying, well, maybe we shouldn't consider this factor so important. When in reality, we know from the research, being in the classroom is sort of the primary factor in whether or not a student will learn. And this is a problem that really hasn't been addressed fully, but something that ought to be addressed moving forward.
And I'll just add that, we really believe that this sign of chronic absenteeism is a indicator of students getting lost in the system and likely an indication that that school may not be the right fit for the student. We've heard success story after success story from private schools in the voucher program to public charter schools, whose once the child find that school and felt like it was the right fit for them, they blossomed in their educational achievement as well as personal growth. And so when we talk about policy solutions for chronic absenteeism, we really want to look through it of what's the problem and why is this child not attending school? And while there might be a variety of reasons, we believe that school choice could be one of the answers to help that child find the right fit for their educational needs.
So now we move on to some of the research that we've conducted at Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty over the past few years. This is our results from our Apples to Apples report. So what we try to do in this report is sort of like what we were talking about earlier with the NAEP data. We know that we need to account for student demographics. Unfortunately, we wish we didn't have to do that. But if we're going to make a fair assessment of sort of educational options, then we need to make sure that we're accounting for those demographic characteristics of students. What you see with the plus signs here, whether we found a positive effect on student proficiency from the program after we'd controlled for all those factors. And here we're looking at private schools in the choice program, district charters and independent charters. We won't go too much into differentiating those two types of charters today. District charters essentially are those that are run by the school district, whereas independent charters are run by a number of other authorizers like the University of Wisconsin system, as well as some others throughout the state, City of Milwaukee included. But we found pretty consistently over time that we are finding a proficiency advantage from the state's choice program. So bolstering what was found in that national research from the previous decade. We found similar things for district charters, and for much of the time we found similar effects for independent charters, though I will have to note that post-COVID we did find a negative effect in reading proficiency and no effect in math proficiency during our most recent report. Obviously this would be concerning if it's a long-term trend, though we do think that we need a couple more years of data post-COVID to fully make that assessment. But the moral of the story here is that the effects that were found in the early days of the Milwaukee program have continued to be found in the Racine and statewide programs. And as those programs grow, we think they're representing more and more a meaningful alternative for families that actually has tangible, better outcomes like Libby alluded to. This is just some more data from our Apples to Apples report. This is actually from the 2019 iteration of the report. But what we see here is the proficiency gap relative to traditional public schools. So we saw that in terms of proficiency in ELA, which is English language arts or reading and math, there was a proficiency advantage of over 4 points for the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, proficiency advantage of just under 4 points for the in math. And then for the charter schools, we see a non-instrumentality. Those are a type, another subtype of district charter that we won't get into today. Pretty substantial performance advantage. And then for independent charters, we also saw an advantage in math. On the other side here, we're looking at the statewide data, and we have found just looking exclusively at the statewide data that there is a proficiency advantage already in math. But statewide, we do see a disadvantage for district charters. I think to some extent that's hard to overcome the urban factor, where most of these schools are located in urban areas. But even excluding the Milwaukee program, the moral of the story here is that we're seeing an advantage growing for our choice programs. So it's important to note here, again, as we move to the more recent years, that our achievement gap isn't just along lines of race, it's also along lines of economic status. A fact that we've said to policymakers many times over the years is that some of our rural school districts that you might think are sort of serving the needs of students very effectively, in terms of outcomes, they don't look that much different than our urban schools. The suburban schools tend to do better, but urban and rural schools tend to be underperform and tend to underperform. And a big factor in that is the sort of income status of families, the ability to which families have the ability to supplement the education their kids are receiving by doing things at home, the amount of time that parents have to spend with students. If they're working 2 jobs, obviously they don't have as much time to do that. But what you see here is just all the schools in the state of Wisconsin is a blue dot on this line. And what we have here is a sort of correlational analysis between the proficiency of those schools and the percent of kids in those schools that are low income. And what you can see is that there's a really straight down line, right? That there are a few exceptions, and those schools deserve to be lauded and praised. But there's a very strong relationship between income status and academic achievement. This obviously is correlated with our racial achievement gap, because we often know that minority families tend to be in the lower levels of income. And so these 2 factors work together to explain pretty substantial achievement gaps in Wisconsin.
And I'll just point out for our participants that, we opened up this presentation in the 90s talking about the achievement gap of students, and we're still talking about it today because this is not a problem that's completely been tackled and addressed. And so again, when we're myth busting the US News and Reports ranking, we're really questioning of if they really think Wisconsin is a top 7 or top 10 school. What are they valuing in that record? Because this issue of the achievement gap, we believe, is a massive reason why Wisconsin's education is not working and is quite failing for some of the families in our great state. So we're going to now kind of end with our current decade. And obviously this one has been just a massive shift in education policy, and for families all across the state. We believe that the pandemic fundamentally changed education in Wisconsin for a variety of reasons. One is parents were able to see into their child's classroom, and the kind of assumptions or experiences that they thought their child were having were quickly debunked, and they realized that whether either their child wasn't reading at grade level, or the teacher wasn't teaching the material they thought was appropriate, or that there just was a lack of focus on academic excellence. I think that really empowered parents and communities to start to ask questions about what does it mean to hold our school districts accountable. And so the timeline below, I wanted to flag a couple of what we think are key moments over the last few years. In March 2020, Governor Evers closes the schools in the state at the time for the pandemic. Moving into the next fall, this is where we really saw the school reopening fights really kind of hit their peak. School districts like Milwaukee and Madison were keeping their doors shut, while many private schools, particularly those in the voucher program, were finding ways to start to serve families, and families were taking notice. So that October, we saw enrollment jump in the choice program by 12,000 students, which is a massive increase in 1 year. And then today, in 2022, we're seeing that 1 in 5 Wisconsin students use some sort of program that allows them to attend a school that isn't their traditionally residentially assigned public school. And so that really leads us into questions about what is the status of education for our kiddos today, who are just this week starting their next school year.
Yeah, absolutely. And for that, we're returning to the NAEP. So the most recent NAEP data that some of you may have seen that was released talking about proficiency rates and a large decline in 3rd grade, unfortunately has not yet been broken down at the state level. So what we have here are the NAEP scores that were found last year. And as well as some of the data from the forward exam. But what we see here is that proficiency fell across the board. And one of the biggest explanatory factors for that is the number of students who have opted out of the test. Now, opt-outs don't mean that they went through the formal process of choosing not to participate in the test. Many students, as Libby can attest to, have sort of disappeared from the system, and we're not really sure of where they are at this point. But in Milwaukee, we had a staggering amount of opt-outs. We had 55% of students opt out of the exam. And when we think about what's going to be seen on the exam results this year, it's important to account for that fact because all of the kids that didn't take the exam were counted as not proficient in the forward exam results. So while we saw dramatic declines in proficiency, we're likely to see a rebound this year. And it's important for folks that are interested and concerned about academic progress to sort of hold schools accountable because the media narrative is in the most straightforward sense is likely to be that, look, proficiency gains across the board. But what we know is that if we account for the number of kids that opt out last year versus this year, we may still be on a downward trajectory. So that's definitely something that we should keep in mind as we look for those results. And I think we're also sort of showing here that as we've moved into the next decade, as we moved into the 2020s, that parents more and more are voting with their feet and choosing these educational options that are alternatives to traditional public schools. We've seen a 3.6% decline in public school enrollment over the last 5 years. That's the red line on this chart. You should note, of course, these are on different scales because the choice programs would still be at the bottom. But we've seen a 34% increase in enrollment in our choice programs in the state. If you couple that with other alternatives like charter schools and open enrollment, this gap has been even more dramatic. And that's the white line you see here going up as public school enrollment declines.
So when we talk about 1 out of every 5 students using a different educational option, what do we really mean by that? And so we just wanted to take a minute and just quickly recap each of the programs and what their status are. And these slides are from our friends at School Choice Wisconsin, who have a great breakdown of all of their of each of the programs on their website. So the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, as mentioned before, was one of the more recent programs enacted by Wisconsin governor at the time, Scott Walker. And it has some unique features to it that actually makes this growth even more interesting. It's been growing rapidly despite having a lower federal poverty line limit for families, despite having what we call our grade point entries, meaning that students can only access the school if they go through or meet specific grade points. And we also know that they have a more limited enrollment period. Yet, despite those really immense challenges, as you can see from the graph, the enrollment in this program has been rapid, and we have 280 schools around the state participating in this program. And so what we think about is, as we talk about the status of education, hopefully we'll be doing this 5 years from now and seeing these graphs grow even more because some of these really critical barriers have been removed. The Racine Parental Choice Program only applies to students who live in the Racine Unified School District. So it's a much smaller population of number, and yet we're seeing that students, again, have been enrolling into this program at high rates of participation. And as you can see, during the pandemic years, it really continued to grow. This program looks more similar to Milwaukee in that it's families must meet the 300% of the federal poverty limit, which is much higher, just under $80,000 a year for a family of 4. And well, we have 27 participating private schools in the in and around, excuse me, the Racine area who are participating. Excuse me, Flanders, I'm gonna have you just take this slide for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Libby gets some water, the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, as we discussed, is the oldest program. Similar income limits or the same income limits as the Racine program, 131 participating schools. Growth is a little bit stagnated in Milwaukee, more so than the other programs in the state. But I think to some extent that's a function of a limitation of supply. We have some really high performing choice schools in Milwaukee. And as we will sort of allude to here, there obviously are funding issues. Choice schools are funded substantially less than traditional public schools. We've been long proponents of getting that funding more close to equal. And we may see it in Milwaukee that the sort of limit on the growth there is that the number of seats in high performing schools is limited, and it's difficult to increase supply much further.
Thank you. I'd also add that what we don't have on the slide, but that if you take the students in Milwaukee who are in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, as well as using other options like charter schools or open enrollment, nearly 50% of all students in Milwaukee are choosing a different option. And so when Flanders talks about supply saturation, we do think that that's one of the policy areas that need to be addressed, because we really want to make sure that every child in the city of Milwaukee has access to the best school for them. And so that's an important policy discussion that we will continue to want to be a part of. The last program we wanted to highlight was the Special Needs Scholarship Program. As you may recall, this is the most recent enacted quote unquote voucher program, although it works pretty differently than our Milwaukee, Racine, and statewide programs. This program is really focused for our families with children with disabilities. As you may know, those families have to navigate immense educational struggles. And one of the biggest challenges to leaving the public school district is funding to educate their children. Those students with disabilities often need more funding than a child without disabilities would need in order to cope and be successful in school. And so this program is designed to serve those families. In order to participate, the only requirement is that your child must have an individualized education plan that shows that they have a disability. There is no income limitation. There's no residency limitation. We have 163 participating schools around the state, and the amount of this voucher is slightly higher than the others at just over $12,000. And while this program isn't perfect, and of course there's room for improvement to make it easier for families to access, in just a few short years, we're really seeing families realize the benefit of this program and start to utilize it all across the state. So we wanted just to conclude with a few slides talking about where does Wisconsin go from here. We really believe that Wisconsin can be a top 10 state for education, but there's a lot of work that has to be done. And so we'd like to conclude by just highlighting some of the issues that we see and policy goals that need to be attained in order to get us to being a top state in education.
Yeah, so one thing that's worth noting, we kind of alluded to earlier, is the state report card. So we discussed how low proficiency is across the board in Wisconsin. But what we know is that schools with many low-income students don't really get ranked on the same scale as other schools in the state that have fewer low-income students. It's a good goal. The goal here is to base the scores in schools with a lot of low-income students on growth. But we've really gone too far in one direction. Some of you folks may have heard me discuss this before, but in a school with no low-income students, the report card scores sort of academic component is based on 72% proficiency and 8% growth. If you have more than 60% low-income kids, it's 8% proficiency and 72% growth. And what that leads to is, folks may wonder why the Milwaukee School District is able to meet expectations with proficiency rates of under 10%. A lot of it does come back to this. There have been a few other changes to the report card that we argue are sort of DPI gaming the system. One of them is what we showed earlier with chronic absenteeism. We saw that it was spiking during the pandemic as students were being lost in the shuffle. The chronic absenteeism deduction was removed as a deduction from the report card this year. We argue that there should be a system in place that keeps the report card the same over time, so it's actually comparable for parents. And we probably should do something as well to ensure that schools are being ranked on something much closer to the same scale, rather than leading to these outcomes where schools with less than 5% proficiency are somehow meeting expectations. And that's a big roadblock to painting a clear picture of where we stand in Wisconsin.
I'd also add that I think this is one of the reasons why people can get taken by rankings, like by the U.S. News and Reports rankings that say you're a great school and you have a great school system. And then they look at the state report card, it says, look, we are great, we're meeting expectations. But when you really, look at the details and kind of dig into the data, you realize it's all a little bit of a myth, and that it's kind of based off of a lot of number magic that's happening. And we think that's unfortunate, because parents and school leaders and teachers need to know what the reality is in their classroom, rather than sort of a myth that that everyone is succeeding and doing great.
Yep, this is just a chart that we've seen proposals recently, and really every year annually for more increases in spending in schools in the state of Wisconsin. And what we show here is proficiency relative to spending. And you'll notice that most of these charts are relatively flat. These correlations are relatively flat. If anything, we tend to see more spending in Wisconsin in districts that are doing worse. This isn't to say that no spending can be useful. I think the research has gotten better in recent years that, spending smartly can have an impact. But simply throwing billions more dollars at public schools isn't likely to lead to that impact. Again, you can look at these charts already and see that it's the case that we have many high-performing schools that are funded at lower levels, and many low-performing schools that are funded at extremely high levels. So, as we think about solutions, more spending, just throwing money at schools isn't likely to solve the problem in any meaningful way. So I think the solution that we're going for, overall here, something we've been saying for years is that we shouldn't be sort of trapping families in schools that don't work for them, and we should be working towards policies that empower every family to choose the options that are best for them. Part of that is public school transparency, and Libby, I'll turn it over to you to sort of discuss some more details on this.
Yeah, so we, quite shockingly, had Governor Evers sign a bill last session that is going to require DPI to create a database that creates more public school spending transparency. This bill created a commission to start the process to create this dashboard, because what we've found is that if you go to the DPI website, it's incredibly difficult to navigate and to know how to find the data and then how to interpret it. I'm lucky enough to have Will Flanders as my colleague, so I can tend to find the answer and understand the data, but certainly we know that not all parents have that. And we really believe that in order to create meaningful and impactful change, we need to start with transparency and empowering parents, but also teachers and school leaders who want to maybe ask questions about what their budget is and how much money is going into the classroom, but it's also opaque in a really complex system. And so this is really a complement to Flanders' last slide talking about smart spending, that we need to be efficient with our dollars, and we need to also be targeting our dollars to the classroom as much as possible, because that is where the real work lies. And that's where we really believe that students can be more academically successful.
Just a couple new initiatives that Will has been working on in the last year or so. One is this phenomenon of political indoctrination in the classroom. So we know that a driving force behind the parental empowerment movement, as Libby sort of said at the beginning of the presentation here, has been parents seeing what's going on in schools and not liking that. So as we think about transparency and making sure that families are aware of what is being taught in their classrooms, we conducted a study in 2021 that looked at a number of school districts around the state, the 10 largest, though we lost one along the way, to acquire basic information about what was being taught in classes. So we looked for terms like CRT, we looked for terms like anti-racism, and we had to spend more than $8,000 to acquire this information from school districts. District would come back and say, we can get you this, but there's going to be a charge. And for these 9 school districts, it was more than $8,000 to acquire this information. The point here is, one, we found issues in every school district. There were, in fact, things that we think should be reported. Some of them are listed on the screen here. Teachers or staff in Cedarburg were instructed that CRT is a way to account for the issues of race, racism, and power that pervade the school system. In Middleton, Cross Plains, the superintendent's on record saying they believe that the education system is inherently racist. And it's not just critical race theory that we're concerned about here. You see the bottom here is a teacher in Sparta, Wisconsin, that was quoted as saying to her class, "The more ignorant we make you, the more poor we make you, the more likely you are to be a Republican or to vote Republican." So it's not just CRT, it's sort of indoctrination across the board that we're concerned about. And the average parent can't spend $8,000 to acquire this information about their schools. So we think curriculum transparency, making sure that parents have this data at their fingertips, is the best way that we can sort of overcome this concern that's definitely based on real factors. Our second report in this series looked a level up. This report was called From the Top. We've gotten some good attention on this with a sort of Wall Street Journal op-ed, even somehow got into the Washington Post with an interview on this. But what we sort of looked at this study is, this isn't teachers on their own unilaterally adopting a liberal agenda. In many cases, this agenda is being influenced by the colleges of education around the state. So what we did was open records request some of the required classes for teachers at each of the public Wisconsin universities, and there were no exceptions. In each of these teacher prep programs, we found evidence of a CRT and liberal bias. We found things like the book Anti-Racist Baby being required. We found that at UW La Crosse, I believe it was, I can double check that, the teachers were being encouraged to bring LGBTQ plus material or an agenda to even the 3-year-old classroom. So starting at the earliest age group, this stuff was being taught. And this is part of our broader, Restoring American Education project, making the argument if teachers have been through this process, it may be through no fault of their own that they're pushing an agenda. They may not even know they're pushing it because they've sort of been absorbed into this environment since they started their college career.
And I think the one thing that I just wanted to add, Flanders, is that, I often think back to my 19-year-old self in college, navigating what I want to do when I grow up and what kind of things I want to study and how I want to change the world. And I think we cannot overemphasize the fact that these classes are mandatory for no matter what type of teacher you want to be, whether it's kindergarten or you want to be a high school math teacher, you are forced to go through these classes without any exceptions. And that's what we're really questioning here is, why are these classes mandated? What role is it serving in preparing teachers to really address the critical problems that I think we've laid out for all of you today, like our racial achievement gap, like our economic gap, and like access to high quality education? And so this report really sort of looks at, trying to understand the source of these issues that have all recently come to light. The last thing we wanted just to highlight is, there's lots of ways to empower parents. We've touched on a couple of them. We talked about smart changes to public school funding. We talked about financial transparency. We also talked about expanding the school choice options. We didn't touch specifically on the curriculum transparency. We supported a bill last session that Governor Evers vetoed that would have required every public school to post their curriculum and teaching materials for parents to be able to access. And our experience doing open records requests to just 9 school districts was so eye-opening on why this bill is so critically needed to help parents feel like they can be partners in their child's education and have access to the materials that are being put in front of their children day after day. The last thing we want to highlight is the Parent Bill of Rights. Again, that's a bill that we were very supportive of last session that Governor Evers vetoed, but we really believe that public school establishment isn't interested in changing. Despite the pandemic, despite the public outrage, they've been very slow to respond to these issues. And so we want to empower parents as much as possible so that they have a seat at the table, because we fundamentally believe that if parents are involved and that a school and the family has the opportunity to pick the right school for their child, academic and personal success will follow. I just want to conclude, and we're happy to take questions then, with 2 resources that we want to highlight for all of you if you'd like to learn more information. The first is the Will School Scorecard resource that can be found on our website. This has information for every school district in the state over time. This will be updated in a few months when the new test scores come out from last year, as well as enrollment from this year. And so we tend and plan to keep this updated, but it's a really good sense to see what's been the long-term trajectory of my child or my resident's school district and where are my tax dollars going and what's been the impact. The other thing we wanted to highlight is this Restoring American Education project. It can also be found on our website. And this is where we have resources for school board members, public school teachers, and parents who really want to engage with their public schools to create meaningful change. And we've put together resources serving all of those different audiences, really hoping to, again, empower and inform people who can really hold their local communities responsible and to really help ensure that their school district curriculum, that their teaching practices, that their vision and mission is aligned with their community values. So with that, we're happy to take any questions. And it looks like we just had one about where you can find enrollment numbers in the choice program. So 2 things. The School Choice Wisconsin website has the enrollment broken down by year for each program. And so I'd first direct you to our friends at School Choice Wisconsin. Secondly, if you'd like the data from DPI over year, please shoot us an email and we can send you that link that is buried somewhere on DPI's website that gives you a look at how enrollment has grown and changed for each program over the last few years. And we're happy to answer any other questions that any of our participants may have. Feel free to either use the chat function or the Q&A. And Flanders, while we're waiting for maybe people to think about a question, one thing for you that I'd want to pose is just from a data perspective, so you do a lot of great work, but are there other resources out there that we should be highlighting?
Yeah, great question. So I think that as it is hard to use, but DPI Wise Dash does have a good amount of state data. That's where we pulled the data from for our dashboard. Now you'll have to go individually and search for it, but there are some factors that aren't yet on our dashboard. So again, while we need a better format, the DPI Wise Dash website does have some of that data. In terms of sort of, stuff on school choice or nationally, I mentioned Ed Choice earlier. They do have a good number of reports that usually have some nice clean graphics that you can use on the benefits of school choice and in a wide variety of different contexts. Other than that, I think we're pretty limited, but those are a couple of good things out there for sure that folks could take a look at.
Great, and we had a couple more questions jump in. So first is, will we be able to review this presentation in the future? Yes, this has been recorded and it's going to go up on our YouTube page for Will, and so you will be able to access and rewatch this presentation in the past or in the future, I should say. And if there are data things or information you'd want to have, our contact information is listed on the screen. So feel free to always email us, and we're happy to share any of the data. Another question we received is any reaction to Governor Evers' proposal to budget $2 million for school that we would presume is primarily going to the public school system. I'll maybe start and then I'll kick it over to Flanders. We're on one hand, we're really disappointed. I think the research that Will has done on school spending and school finance, as well as national research, shows dumping more money into a system is not the answer. We have to be smarter with our taxpayer dollars to really ensure that these dollars are reaching the kiddos that really need it. The other thing that stuck out to me is just Governor Evers included a lot of information about a reading program in this recent release. And, there were multiple reading bills last session that were based on the immense success that Mississippi experienced in the past few years. And Governor Evers vetoed all those bills. And so he had a chance with bills that had bipartisan support to really change how we look at reading proficiency and how we help students in the state of Wisconsin. And he chose not to do that. And so we are really skeptical of the assumption that more money equals better outcomes. Flanders, do you have anything to add? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Got issues with garbleness at the beginning and planes and all sorts of things today. So apologies, everyone. No, I think you covered it pretty well, Libby, but I think that, our slide earlier showed that the proficiency in the state is really unrelated to spending levels, and some of our best funded districts are some of our worst performing. So there's really no reason to think that unilaterally putting more money into the schools is going to actually have a meaningful effect on outcomes. Not that there should never be any more money, right? We recognize inflation. We recognize that there are, things that may require more funding at this point, but it's got to be careful. It's got to be smart and not just unilateral increases.
So the next question was about how to access our research. So on our Will scorecard, we have looked at how the state has invested money from the local and state spending perspective, and then student proficiency. But we are looking at, and more information is to come on both where that money is going in the school district. So this scorecard doesn't answer the question yet about investment into school district administration versus sort of the in-classroom resources, nor does it address the vast amount of state referendas that are passed every year. I can assure you that those research is actually in the works, and we're hoping to roll that out in the next, hopefully a month or so, that's really going to look at over time. Again, what are the trends we're seeing in how school districts are asking for and spending money? As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we don't have an easy system in the state of Wisconsin to look at and track where every dollar is going. But with the system we have, we're really trying hard to put together research projects that are giving as much information as possible. And then the other question we got on this was, have we looked at how much school spends on administrative functions, pension versus how much go to the teachers? So that's kind of repetitive to what I just said, but again, to the best of our ability with the information the state currently gives us, we have done some of that work, but it's really challenging for a variety of reasons. One is every school district doesn't budget the same way, and there is 10,000 different codes that school districts can use when they're budgeting. And so there isn't an easy way to break that down. And if any of you have had the unfortunate experience that Flanders and I have had of trying to read through a school district budget spreadsheet, it's really difficult. And so we're hoping that this bill, the Public School Spending Transparency Bill, is going to lead to that sort of dashboard where you have true apples to apples comparison by category, by cost, and by revenue for each school district in the state. At this point, under our current system, we're going to need DPI to be a part of that process because school districts aren't mandated or required to include or report that type of information.
Notice that our best work on this so far is the 2021 report called Truth in Spending. So if you look on our website for that report, that's where we've done everything we can with the data as it is, with the limitations Libby noted, to sort of capture how districts are spending money and how much is going to administration versus the classroom. In that report, we're at about 50%. So about half of the money that's spent on schools is on administration or other services rather than teachers. And I think that's a good way to sort of turn the debate around on the unions and folks, right? If you're concerned about more pay, if we want to help the teacher pipeline, why is so much money not getting to teachers in your district? And that data, while it's hard to access, I think to the extent we can get folks to begin to question that, it's helpful to our side in terms of creating a system where money is being spent smartly.
I completely agree. So another question we got was, how are we sharing these resources to school board members? So one is we're doing events like this, trying to highlight some of the work that we have. We also work with our allies, both in Wisconsin and partners around the country, to try to push out resources as much as possible. Little preview, tomorrow we'll be sending out an email that will actually include additional parent resources to prepare them as their kiddos go back to school this year. So we are constantly updating our resources. You can join our email list by going to our website at will-law.org, and that would guarantee that you'd get all of our emails that we're putting out about our resources. But we're hoping, and please feel free to share our website, our resources on social media with your own networks, because we found that word of mouth has been the most powerful anecdote to parents who have felt really lost in this process. The next question is, tell us about the new social emotional program in schools. I am not as familiar with the different types of programs that are out there, but those are sorts of issues that we want to continue to pay attention to and look at. So I'd encourage anybody to email Flanders or myself questions like that so we can spend some time doing research to give a better answer. Flanders, can you repeat the name of the report that that you talked about? Is Truth in Spending from 2019, am I correct?
Yep, that's right. I was actually going to put a link in the chat. And actually it's 2019, not 2021. I misspoke, but I'll put a link in the chat in a second.
And are we sharing, another question is, are we sharing this information with WASB? We are sharing this information publicly, wide and far, with as many people who are interested to sit down and talk with us and listen. And should we have the opportunity, and should they decide to open their door, we would love to have that conversation, because again, this is about creating excellent schools, no matter what type of school it is, across the state, and really helping us achieve what we would hope would be the true status of being a top 10 education system in the state of Wisconsin. So with that, I believe we addressed all the questions, and we're just so grateful and thank you for joining us today. Again, our contact information is on the screen, as well as a link to our website with some of these school board and parent resources at Restoring American Education in Wisconsin. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks all.